And
Hi everyone, welcome to the test optional session for the Harn Counselor Update. I'm Crystal Garcia with the University of South Alabama, and we're so excited to tell you more about test optional.
hi, my name is Genesis Castillo, and I'm from the University of Houston, Victoria. I'm going to give you guys a couple of definitions of test optional. So test optional, schools do not require test scores from applicants in order to be considered for admission. Test flexible, schools may require test scores from certain applicants, or test scores are not weighted as heavily in admission decisions. And test blind means school does not consider test scores as part of the admission criteria.
So as you can tell from Genesis already, there are different ways that schools are handling this test optional thing. And so there are those of us who are allowing students to opt in or opt out. There are those of us who, depending on perhaps other admission criteria, we may or may not be considering test scores. And then there are those of us who are not looking at testing, even if it is provided as part of a student's application. So we absolutely understand how this can be a confusing, I guess, criteria and a confusing process within the admissions process as well. We do want to recognize too that sometimes schools that even are test optional may not necessarily be test optional across the board. And so there are institutions for whom perhaps they have a particular threshold or admission requirements where a student can be test optional and then other students cannot. And so for instance, an example of this might be if a student is in the top 50% of their class, they can apply test optional, but if they are in the bottom half of their class, they must have testing. We are seeing that some institutions are also test optional for general admissions, but not necessarily for a particular program or a particular major. And typically those would be some of the most popular majors on campus or some of the most selective majors on campus as well. We are seeing that there are institutions that are test optional for admissions, but not necessarily for scholarships or not necessarily for all scholarships. And so this can be a component as well that, especially with some of the competitive awards, test scores may still be required. We are also seeing, and I would actually say that this is a little more of a commonality between institutions as well. Sometimes international students may not necessarily have the option of applying test optional. This is actually true for Trinity. And so we are still requiring some sort of test score for our international student applicants, although it does not have to be an SAT or an ACT. It could be the TOEFL, or they could actually supply us with a Duolingo test score, which is actually very easy to schedule as it's taken from your own home, your own laptop, and you can schedule that exam whenever you would like to do so. We're also seeing that sometimes homeschool students are in this same umbrella as well, that maybe with homeschool students, they are not test optional, or they might have a separate application requirement. And again, this is true actually for Trinity. So if a homeschool student is applying to Trinity, they would actually need to conduct an interview in lieu of having test scores. We are, however, test optional for both admission and for scholarship and for any major that a student may want to pursue. I think it's helpful to have a little bit of an idea of even the other colleges that are in with us today as far as how our own institutions are approaching some of these objectives. Genesis, do you want to talk a little bit about UHV and how you may see some of these things within your school?
Yes, ma'am. So with UHV, we are test optional only for admissions, and our requirements are to be top 50% of your class, have a 2.0 GPA, and if you have a test score, it would be a 19 on your ACT or 940 on your SAT. I'm sorry, 18 on your ACT. So yeah, so if you don't have those requirements, then so we can go with the test optional, and that's where it will be top 60% or a 2.0 on your GPA.
And Crystal, what about South Alabama?
Thank you, Gail. So we are test optional for admissions and scholarships, with the caveat if students have above a 21 ACT or 1060 SAT, we recommend they go ahead and send in their scores, because then I'll qualify them for more scholarship money. So if that's the case, then again, just choose, and depends on, check in with the specific high school, or my bad, the specific college institution that you are looking at for what the criteria is, since test optional differs across universities.
And Molly, finish us up with Texas Tech here.
Everyone. So at Texas Tech, we are going to be test optional for admissions and for scholarships. We do still have our merit-based scholarship, which will be based upon the class rank and ACT or SAT test scores if the students have them. Otherwise, the scholarships are going to be given based upon a holistic review.
Sounds great, guys. Thank you.
Sorry. Okay, so I'm Molly. I'm with Texas Tech University. I'm going to talk real quick just about which students should be applying as test optional. So the main one is just going to be obviously students that don't have test scores. We're seeing the ACT and SAT being canceled, I think since like March. So we know that there's a lot of students out there who are unable to have taken their test. Also, students should apply test optional if they believe that their test scores aren't representative of their academic strength. So those are going to be your students that say, I'm just not a good test taker. I don't do strong on, standardized tests and things like that. Those are going to be the students that are going to want to then go test optional. And alternatively, they might think that their other parts of their application are stronger than their test scores. So that might be their essays, their extracurricular activities, their letters of recommendation. So it's going to be really important during this admission cycle that we are stressing the importance of that holistic review. And, students are taking more time that although sometimes essays are optional on applications, that if they're going test optional, they are making sure to submit essays, submit letters of recommendation, and filling out that application in its entirety so that schools are able to make the best decisions when they go test optional based upon their other criteria.
Awesome. Thank you, Molly. So here we have all of our names, respective universities, as well as our email addresses. We can all, of course, talk to you more about test optional, as well as what our university's criteria is. But right now, we do have 10 minutes. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to put it in the chat function, and we're more than happy to address and answer any questions that y'all have. Right now, Gail just put in a Google Doc that pretty much lists every institution that is with HARN. Essentially, it's an Excel sheet that lists all of our names, whether we're test optional or not, as well as criteria for freshmen transfers, as well as COVID-19 related resources. So definitely check out that doc, save it. So we do have a question. Are LORs from outside school a positive or holistic review? Can someone answer that question? I personally don't know what LOR is.
Yeah, I can take that. Letters of rec. And so I think that's a great question. We require 2 letters of recommendation already, but both of the required letters of recommendation will be as part of in school. And so typically we want to see the counselor recommendation. So thank you all for submitting those. And we want to see the teacher recommendation as well. I think that the question is really about outside of school recommendation letters. I think that sometimes they can be helpful and sometimes they are just added information that isn't necessarily going to be as weighed as heavily as others. So I think that when students are indeed submitting something from outside of school, we really want to make sure that we are seeing a different side of the student. Is it a supervisor perhaps at work, or is it someone that they've interned for? Is it a youth group director that they've worked with closely over the last 8 years and it really has a great character recommendation for them? So I think I would just encourage students to be a little bit more mindful about who they are asking outside of school and certainly limit it to 1. That being said, some schools do not want to see outside of school recommendations. And so definitely check with the institution as well, whether it will actually be allowed to be received or not. Any additions to that, you all?
No? Okay. Great. Thank you so much for answering that question, Gail. So another question we have is, if a student applies test optional but decides to test after submitting their application, can they contact admissions and submit scores, or vice versa scenario?
Yeah, I can go ahead and take this one. It's a great question. We went over it in the last session too. So I think for all of the universities in this session, you can kind of flip flop, right? If you apply, and then you decide that you want to take test scores or submit test scores, you can do that just by contacting the admissions. I know a couple of the other universities have it on like the students portal, or where they have to fill out a form. So it's definitely just getting in contact with that counselor. For tech, if a student decides to go test optional and then later decides they want to submit test scores, if a decision's already been made on their application, they would just have to go through a reevaluation process. If they were denied for some reason, but then they can definitely submit those test scores for scholarship purposes and things like that as well.
So we are allowing students to opt in or opt out as part of the application. So that is the question that they will either have listed on the Common App or Coalition or Apply Texas for Trinity. And then within their Trinity portal, if they do decide that they'd like to change their mind, they have up until the application deadline to fill out a form there and do so. I think it's important to note that for us as well at Trinity, if a student has submitted test scores, that does not automatically indicate that they have opted in. So again, they have to opt in either on that application or on the form afterwards before the deadline as well. And so if they have submitted test scores, maybe let's say from December, before we were test optional and now have decided to opt out, we will actually strike those test scores from our records as well. And so we will not be considering those as part of the application process.
Awesome. Yeah, and please feel free to add any more questions. Just kind of echoing everyone's sentiment and just adding some more information as well is, say a student goes test optional and they want to switch to having a test score or whichever it may be. Say a student is already admitted and they took the test and they got a higher score. They can still be in consideration for more scholarship money, whether it's March, whether it's May, even if it's the summertime. So definitely keep that in mind as well. And is there anything else that anybody would like to add? Just any general advice for counselors as they're navigating these uncertain waters? Yeah, so one question, but still think of advice that y'all would like to give is, how does a student decide to send test scores or not?
I think this is a tough one. And Molly, I saw you unmute too, so I definitely want you to pitch in. I think this can be a really confusing part of that question. Should I send test scores? Should I not send test scores? I don't think that this is necessarily an absolutely true across the board answer, but I will say kind of general rule of thumb, if a student's test score falls within the middle 50% of that institution to which they're applying, I probably would recommend to go ahead and send a test score if they have it. If it falls lower than that middle 50% for the university, I would likely encourage the student to apply test optional. But I think that there will always be exceptions to that rule as well. There might be a student who really interviews extraordinarily well, and so that can certainly be a perk too. So I think that there are going to be some differences there too. Molly, did you want to add anything to that? I'm sorry, I jumped in first there.
No worries. Yeah, I think that's a big question we're seeing now with students worrying that it looks bad if they don't submit test scores. So just, encouraging those students that finding the best option that fits for them is definitely going to be really important. That we don't think, oh, they didn't submit test scores, that must mean their test scores are low. We know it's a very different time. And we're actually just like supporting students. It's more of like we want to be giving them as many options as possible to be able to fill out their applications. So it definitely does not look bad if a student selects test optional.
Great, thank you so much. So right now, Gail just put into the chat, we do have about 3 minutes left, so feel free to stay, but also feel free to jump into the next session. We have 4 other topics to choose from. If we do not have any questions, we would like to thank everyone for their time, and thank you so much for joining us and listening to us. Our contact information is listed here. If y'all do have any more questions, we are always happy to help.